The first time the Beatles recorded together as the unit, We Know and Love, was on August 22, 1962, when Granada Television came to document this up-and-coming Liverpool band. Can you guess the date the Beatles last met to record music as four members? August 22nd, 1969. And the song they recorded? The End. In that 7 years, they recorded almost all the canonical singles and albums we know and love. And it's not just singles, such as Hey Jude, She Loves You and Ticket to Ride, that loom large in our national consciousness. Their knack of writing exhilarating singles was matched by seminal album tracks and fabulous filler. That meant the clamour for a Beatles reunion began as soon as the Beatles broke up. But after the founder member, John Lennon, was shot outside his apartment in 1980, the dream of the Beatles ever recording together again appeared to have died. However, during his 5-year hiatus from the music business in the latter half of the 1970s, John Lennon recorded a number of demos on his Sony boombox which were left unfinished. In 1994, 4 of these tracks were given to Paul McCartney by Yoko Ono, John's widow, on 2 cassettes, and rumour has it the Now and Then cassette was marked For Paul in John Lennon's hastily written hand. In the hours after John's death, Paul reportedly told BBC Newsbeat journalist Richard Skinner that he and John had been planning to meet that December to write music together.
Suddenly one of the girls came through and said, "Richard, Paul McCartney on the phone." So I went to the back office, the editor's office, and shut the door and had a long conversation with Paul, who wouldn't go on air. He was so upset, and we talked about John, and we talked about plans that he tells me in the phone call he and John had to get together and try and write music together again that would have been happening that December. But the studio they wanted to use was booked out, so they didn't work together, and they were hoping to meet up in the new year.
It might also tie in with the Long and Winding Road project, a precursor to the anthology series that was set in motion way back in 1969 and even edited in a rough form that has since been leaked online. On November 28, 1980, John Lennon wrote a legal statement using the unreleased documentary as a reason for the production of the Broadway musical Beatlemania to cease. John's deposition read, "I and the other 3 former Beatles have plans to stage a reunion concert, an event to be filmed and included as the finale to The Long and Winding Road, the official Beatles-produced documentary that is to be released in the mid-1980s. All that being said, according to Get Back director Peter Jackson and Beatles producer Jeff Lynne, the cassettes Yoko gave to Paul were not originals or even copies of an original. It therefore seems unlikely that the Beatles themselves ever received a demo cassette of John's with For Paul written on it in his own hand. But regardless of how much truth there is to the For Paul story, we know John and Paul were on the cusp of working together again. Nearly 14 years after John's death, Paul took the songs Yoko gave him into his Sussex studio to work on them with his 2 remaining bandmates. For this project to get off the ground, George stipulated that his Wilburys bandmate, Jeff Lynne, produce. Bringing in an outsider to help when egos were a little fragile was an old trick George had used in years prior, as with Eric Clapton and Billy Preston. Paul was wary of working with someone sponsored by George. However, John had noted in the early 70s that ELO, Jeff Lynne's band, had continued where the Beatles left off.
We're going to play Electric Light Orchestra from last year, Showdown, which I thought was a great record, and I was expecting it to be number 1, but I don't think UA got their fingers out and pushed it. And it's a nice group. I call them Son of Beatles. I remember the statement they made when they first formed was to carry on from where the Beatles left off with Walrus, and they certainly did.
It was seemingly written in the stars that Lynne should eventually work on the Beatles' reunion song. So, no need for Paul to worry.
He's very diplomatic, and, he lets you do your thing, and he's just sort of the controller. He just makes sure it's all right.
Paul got on well with Jeff Lynne and would work with him on his own album, Flaming Pie, released 1997. Meantime, the former Beatles producer, George Martin, tactfully claimed his hearing was not good enough to work on the project, but he went on to produce the album In My Life and work on the Beatles' Love soundtrack album. In the event, the remaining Beatles worked on 3 of the 4 tracks Yoko gave them: Free as a Bird, Real Love, and Now and Then. Besides being singles, these were intended to be included on the anthology series of albums. Anthology meaning a then innovative concept of outtakes, unreleased tracks, live recordings, and media excerpts. There were still tensions between George and Paul at this time, and wary of upsetting George, Paul played a deliberately simple bass part on Free as a Bird to forestall accusations of being too fussy, as George had accused Paul of being in reference to his intricate style on something. Likewise, Paul was careful to praise George's bluesy guitar solo in the media, though the compliment was somewhat backhanded as he contrasted it with the guitar style on My Sweet Lord, which he was not fond of. Arguably, John's songs needed development, but the Beatles left them more or less as they were and simply beefed them up with instrument and vocal overlay, some very limited lyric infill in the case of Free as a Bird. For this reason, the UK chart positions of 2 and 4 can probably be considered as reasonable in the circumstances. Though, as the years have passed and a new generation of Beatles fans have listened to them without such high expectations, the virtues of the songs have shone through. In 2014, a memorable John Lewis Christmas advert used a Tom Odell cover of Real Love that replaced the overproduced Beatles single with a stripped-down version that highlights the gentle poignancy of John's original song. As for Free as a Bird, arguably it has a fragmentary quality to it. But it's a beautiful fragment, with spellbinding harmonies and a pioneering video chock full of Easter eggs to go with it. The Beatles are unlikely to go down in history as a spearheading video promo band, but Free as a Bird will surely go down as a great video. But Now and Then was never to be completed, leaving the final album in the anthology series somewhat in the lurch, as the other singles each opened series 1 and 2 of the anthology albums respectively. George had simply grown tired of it and decided it was a lousy song.
George went off it. Fucking hell. Fucking rubbish, this is. It was like, no, George, this is John. It's still fucking rubbish, you know. Oh, okay, then. So that one's still lingering around, so I'm going to nick in with Jeff and do it, finish it.
Paul was clearly disappointed by this, and in many respects, this was simply business as usual. George pouring cold water on ideas Paul was keen on. But if George would often nix ideas, one can say that in at least 1 or 2 cases, this forced Paul to come back with better and more creative ones. The Beatles rooftop concert essentially came about because George said no to everything else that director Michael Lindsay Hogg could think of during the Get Back sessions, and rooftop concerts are now a rite of passage for certain rock bands. With George passing in 2001, the last thing most of us expected was a new Beatles single. It took 27 years for 2 important events to occur. In 2007, the Beatles Love Project normalized the idea of using Beatles samples on a Beatles track. And in 2021, the documentary series Get Back utilized sound separation software, paving the way for Now and Then to receive the same treatment. With a little help from Sean Lennon, who gave Peter Jackson a first-generation copy of the demo. So what and who is Now and Then about?
I think it just means now and then, you know. Now and then I have a cup of tea. I'm not sure it means an awful lot more than that. But looking at it from today's perspective, now and then you can start to get all sorts of meanings in.
It could be a love song in which John expresses his gratitude to Yoko. But it actually makes much more sense that the song is about a friend John is separated from, as the chorus lyric goes, "Now and then, I miss you." And the friend that it obviously fits is Paul. Is it Paul? What we can say with certainty is the words "now and then" have taken on some particular resonance. In 1981, during the Tug of War sessions, when Paul was still getting over the death of John, his old idol Carl Perkins was working on the album with him. Carl very much enjoyed his stay with Paul and Linda, and thanked Paul by writing a song called My Old Friend. When Carl Perkins played the song, the lyrics of the last 2 verses were, "If we never meet again, this side of life. In a little while over yonder, where it's peace and quiet. My old friend, won't you think about me?"
Every now and then.
Tears streamed down Paul's face as he stepped outside, but Linda thanked Carl. Paul hadn't broken down in tears since John died, and he'd needed to. But Linda wanted to know something. How did Carl know? Know what? Carl asked. The reply Linda gave is now enshrined in Beatle history. There's two people in the world that know what the last thing John Lennon said to Paul was.
Think about me every now and then, old friend.
Words spoken to Paul by John in the hall of the Dakota building, and clearly words Paul had never forgotten.
It was a touching moment, and it was kind of a little frightful moment for me.
My Old Friend was a song which, contrary to his usual practice, Perkins had not written down, having the strange feeling that he would remember it.
My old friend, won't you think about me every now and then? And that was the little girl that answered the original phone call. Hello?
Paul McCartney just called.
Bud, are you kidding me?
No, but I didn't answer the phone. I was in the...
Who's this going to take McCartney? Paul McCartney. Now listen, I'm telling you guys.
Hear me?
He left his number. Now let me tell you something. If you think that this boy is not got connection with the spirit world.
As I edit this video, racing to meet my Friday deadline, the UK Top 40 chart has just been published. And who's at number 1? The Beatles with Now and Then. A song title with a surprising number of layers, encapsulating as it does that the Beatles were not just a cultural phenomenon in the 60s, but remain so today.
It feels very synchronous that the lyric speaks about time and that it's taken so much time and it sort of fuses the past and the present. It all feels very meant to be.
Who knows what's next? A Peter Jackson version of the Star Club tapes, an extended cut of Magical Mystery Tour, perhaps even a remixed version of Now and Then with the missing bridge.
Did you guys work on the bridge at all? Did it work? Obviously, you didn't think it did if it was cut.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
The bridge, the I Don't Want to Lose You bridge from the song.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
Of course, it really is the end and the final chord has been played. But in the run-out groove, new Apple releases will forever ripple.
I absolutely love this song. It's beautiful. I have to say I do prefer the demo.